We turn now to discussing the school funding system in Australian education policy. So school funding is a shared responsibility of both the federal and the state and territory governments, but also private actors get to intervene in the funding system of Australian schools. So mostly the federal government will provide the majority of funding to non-government schools, and that can often go up to 80% of their schooling resource standards and around 25% to government schools. When it comes to government schools, the state and territory governments tend to give the biggest share of the funding. And also there is a contribution to non-government schools, even from the state and territory level government as well. And of course, the private contributions also in terms of school fees, donations, and fundraising related money comes to reinforce the funding system of independent and Catholic schools. But also this might be present to some extent in public schools, although that tends to be in a really smaller share compared to the general funding received from government bodies. So for non-government schools, public funding is adjusted based on communities' financial capacity. And of course, lower fee schools receive more government support than elite institutions. And of course, in this recording, we shall try to focus on understanding a little bit more how all these are calculated and on what ground governments get to decide where to give or to which school to give more money than other schools. So this graph is just really illustrating the trends in gross income by sector for all schools in 2023, the most recent figures available. So first, let's look at the public schools and government schools. What you'll notice here is that the light blue section represents funding from the federal government, while the dark blue majority comes from the state and territory governments. So if we can look at the government schools, you'll see that much of the budget here is coming really from, much of the budget for the public school is coming from the state level, as we said, territory government, whereas a bit smaller share really is coming from the federal government, and again, even less from private institutions or private sources of funding. Now, when we look at the Catholic schools, we see a different pattern. Over 60.4% of their funding comes from the federal government, and the state and territory governments get to contribute only a little, about really 15.1% of their overall income per year. We also see parental contributions through fees, but these tend to be much smaller than those of those in independent schools or, private schools, if I can say so. So independent schools tend to follow a quite different logic. A little bit more of their funding comes from fees and charges and parents' contributions. Whereas, of course, the government systems of funding goes as low as 38.6 for the Commonwealth government and as low as 10% for the state and territory government. Just really to give you a snapshot of, who funds what in our schools system. And of course, you can find more details by just clicking on this link here to get to understand more on, on what ground different schools are being funded and by which actors. Now, the next consideration is how does the government then determine levels of funding for different schools? So the school resource standards is just an estimate really of how much total public funding a school needs to meet its students' educational needs. So this is a governed way of determining the funding needed by different schools. And that's the ground on which the government gets to determine which school deserves to get more money than other schools. So the SRS is an estimate of the total public funding, specifically the federal government money. And all these, again, are quite determined based on the needs a school raises to meet its students' educational needs. And this can be determined also based on the number of students who are enrolled in a school, which is multiplied by the SRS funding amount. And again, there are some calculations ongoing there to get to determine the final budget allocation, which the federal government can allocate to different schools. So each year, the Federal Department of Education calculates this SRS for every school, and they really do this by adding a base amount which is determined by the number of students enrolled and which they multiply by the SRS funding amount for that year. And again, there are a few other considerations which we shall be looking at into how these are, calculated and determined at federal government level to allocate money to different types of schools. So, yeah, what else? Maybe just mention that the SRS funding, and again, this is just really to give you a brief snapshot of what it has been like over the last few years and in this year in particular. You'll see that it has been determined and this is only in relation to students with disability. Just as an example, that it has been determined that primary school students, there might be a need of up to $13,991 to fund individual students. Whereas for secondary school students, it can go up to $17,000. And again, as I said, different actors will intervene in funding this. For private schools, it's mostly the Commonwealth government, which gets to fund up to 80% of their total income. And the state level gets to fund up to 20%, whereas for public school, it is the reverse. It is the opposite, that for public schools, it is rather the state and territory level which gets to fund the biggest share, whereas the Commonwealth government only funds a smaller portion of the needed money. So we might want to look at how funding based on enrollment numbers can create compounding effects of disadvantage and disparities even in the way schools operate. So this diagram, which was suggested by NOUS group, is really just building some insights into, how schools can get to be disadvantaged based on the funding system in place and specific circumstances of different schools, which lead to maybe underfunding, and that underfunding in itself leads to, schools being in, experiencing disadvantage, or people in specific areas or conditions getting to be disadvantaged in the funding system. And those issues might even go up to leading some schools to close. Criteria such as schools which are not performing well, schools with low staff turnover, schools which can't attract, qualified staff members, students who attend these schools tend to be quite disadvantaged. And I think there is, this can also be linked to how social disadvantage operates depending on where you live and who you are. And again, all those will get to determine which school you can attend. But what happens actually in the funding system is that this gets to, reflect how students who are enrolled in some of these schools might be disadvantaged. But these schools themselves also can be disadvantaged in the funding system up to even the point of not receiving as much funding as other schools, maybe because of the limited number of students who attend those schools. And ultimately, some of these schools can end up even closing. I'm even thinking here also of schools which are based in remote geographical areas. And you'll realize that in many of these remote areas, one of the biggest issue is actually the aging population living in those areas. And as the population keeps aging, then it becomes hard for schools in those areas to keep attracting a large number of students. And now that the funding which is allocated to schools is calculated based on the number of students as one of the criteria, you'll see that many of these schools will just end up closing, and that in itself reflects again the trends in social disadvantages, but also in terms of challenges and opportunities different schools might have to face at different point. So another key issue to really look at here is the understanding and measuring of socio-educational advantage and disadvantages, and how they also operate together. So socio-educational advantage is something which is being also measured in terms of, and this is quite related to what we've been discussing on the previous slide. So we do measure this by what is called the index of community socio-educational advantage. So this is just really a tool for understanding the broader context in which a school operates. It's not really a measure of the school's quality itself or school's ranking, but it's just a measure of looking at these broader socioeconomic determinants which might lead specific schools to be disadvantaged in the funding system, and what would that mean technically to the children and families which send their children in those schools. So it's mostly based on a number of 1,000. So we tend to measure schools based on a scale of 800 to 1,200, and schools below 1,000 indicate a lower level of educational advantage for their students. And schools above that threshold are determined to have a higher level of educational advantage. So, and as you go through the next slides, you'll hear more, you'll really find out more about how this index helps decision makers take important decisions based on specific schools' circumstances, such as, where those schools are located, the proportion of indigenous students attending those schools, how remote is that school, and so on and so forth. So all these criteria come together to make us make decision makers to take important decisions regarding how to support different schools based on their specific circumstances. Thank you very much. In the next recording, we shall be speaking about the ideology and values and how these inform our understanding of education as a human right. Bye for now.